Today is Saturday, October 14th. And today we are hoping to give you more context and analysis surrounding the attack in Israel on October 7th and the now unfolding war. We first want to acknowledge that this is a very complex conflict with decades, even centuries of history behind it that we could never fully cover in a less than 20-minute podcast episode. And it's important to note also, this conversation was recorded on Wednesday, so a lot has continued to develop since then that we will continue to cover in our news roundups during the week. But we do think this conversation is still relevant to help you understand more about what's happening and the groups involved. So I'm joined by author, journalist, and director of Century International, Thanassis Cambanis. Century International is an independent think tank that produces original research on the human impact of global policy. And Cambanis focuses his work on U.S. foreign policy, Arab politics, and social movements in the Middle East. We discuss how Hamas first came to power, the conditions in the region even before this attack, the U.S. role in all of this now, and much more. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Thanassis Cambanis, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Erica, happy to be with you.
So let's start with the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th. Can you speak to the unexpected and unprecedented nature of this attack?
We've had a history of rocket fire traded back and forth from Gaza into Israel and retaliatory bombing by Israel afterwards. Previously to this war, there's been very little fear of infiltration of actual armed men and fighters entering Israel proper. That is the kind of threat that most Israelis have long ago thought was a thing of the past.
Because of the Israeli military?
For, I think, two reasons. One, they believe that the Israeli security forces were effectively doing their jobs and serving as a deterrent, and they mistakenly, I guess, believed that their opponents had given up on this tactic. Even Palestinians who support Hamas, I don't think any of them expected that Hamas would try, much less be able to pull off a military operation of this scale. So that was one huge surprise. Another huge surprise was just the sheer ferocity and indiscriminate targeting of civilians of the attack. So this was not collateral damage by an armed group that was trying to achieve some kind of military objective. A third layer is the colossal intelligence failure. There's a lot of reporting coming out that the government of Egypt warned Israel 3 days before the attack to expect something like this, and those warnings were apparently not heeded. So the fact that they were not ready at all, and in fact, it seems the Israeli military had really watered down pre-existing defenses around Gaza. So whatever had been the status quo level of military readiness around Gaza was drastically different, eroded, maybe had been relocated elsewhere as Israel focused on other priorities.
Let's go back and just help people understand, who is Hamas, what do they stand for, and are they supported by any of the Palestinians that live there?
Hamas is the main Islamist branch of Palestinian factional politics. Hamas really came to prominence in the 80s and 90s as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Fast forward to 2005, Israel withdrew its settlements from Gaza. Then we have, in short order, the last elections that Palestinians were allowed to take part in 2005 and 2006. In the legislative elections, Hamas won a plurality. Subsequently, there was a standoff and then a small-scale civil war inside Gaza, and Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip and its government in 2007. They have ruled the Gaza Strip since then, since 2007, with an authoritarian, violent mode of governance. Polls suggest their popularity has been shrinking steadily for that entire period of time. I think the most recent poll from about a year ago suggests that 20 to 30% of people in Gaza support Hamas at all. I'm skeptical even of how accurate such polling can be, but they are not a popular movement, and they have been ruthless in their violent squelching of dissent by the many, many people in Gaza who do not support them. And just as a last point, Hamas has done a terrible job of governing Gaza, right? So just in terms of livelihood, well-being, healthcare, food, education, they've been abysmal. So they are, on the one hand, fairly discredited, on the other hand, fairly strong because of their authoritarian tactics.
And yet, many blame Israel for oppressing and restricting the 2 million people who live in the Gaza Strip. Groups like Human Rights Watch have called Gaza an open-air prison even before this attack from Hamas. So what's your take on that? And even the people who have gone so far as to say this is the oppressed fighting back.
Hamas is a problematic and bad organization that, among other things, is a designated terrorist group by multiple governments, including that of the U.S. That in no way gets Israel off the hook. Gaza is subjected to a level of isolation and blockade that is not only illegal under international law, but is inhumane. And so Israel has followed some really bad policies and in many cases has committed documented violations of international law. Those violations and those problems are in a way independent of the problem of Hamas, right? I mean, these are, I think Israel can and should address its bad policies here. If it does, it still will face a problem in the armed extreme threat from Hamas. These things aren't causing each other. So that's where we lead to the second thing you mentioned. So there are people who understandably and justifiably support the rights of Palestinians and then connect that to somehow justify crimes against humanity or war crimes committed by an extremist group, in this case Hamas. And, that's especially unhelpful because it's actually quite easy to support Palestinian rights without supporting the extreme agenda of these militant groups. In my view, groups like Hamas are incredibly detrimental to the cause of Palestinian rights as well.
And now, after this brutal attack from Hamas, Israel is retaliating with what's been called a total siege on the Gaza Strip. Not only airstrikes, but cutting off necessities like electricity and food. What's your take on that? Is Israel going too far, or is it simply their right to defend themselves and they have to show the rest of the Middle East that they will respond in this way?
Of course, Israel, like all states and peoples everywhere, has the right to defend itself. The question is, one, can Israel obey and uphold norms of international law while retaliating against Hamas? And in my view, it can and should. What we shouldn't see, and what we are seeing, unfortunately, is a policy of collective punishment against people in Gaza for the actions of Hamas. So a better approach to Gaza would be, first of all, not to do these things that are war crimes and also unethical, like cutting off water and electricity to 2.25 million people because of what Hamas did. So target Hamas by all means. Don't implicate all 2.25 million people who live in an area which, by the way, many of those people are already suffering under Hamas to begin with, and now they're going to suffer additionally under what Israel itself described as a total siege.
What is the role of the U.S. right now in all of this, and what's your take on its response so far?
The U.S. role should be to support Israel, but also to publicly and thoughtfully advocate for Israel to act with restraint, proportionality, and in keeping with the international norms and the laws of war. So the U.S. is in a position to do this. It hasn't done so as forcefully as it could. President Biden, in his remarks, said we will stand with Israel. And he also said that, he encourages Israel to respond with proportionality. As one pundit put it, friends don't let friends commit war crimes. And I think that is what the U.S. position should be.
So what's the risk of this violence spreading beyond Israel and Gaza to the rest of the Middle East? Our guest weighs in. Plus, he speaks to a couple of the main misconceptions and more. We'll get into that just ahead. Is there a risk of this conflict spreading to other parts of the Middle East?
I think the risk of a regional conflagration is very significant. There have been at least 2 or 3 occasions where we were watching the border between Lebanon in Israel and thinking that maybe tit for tat bombings over that border would escalate into outright war. People have evacuated southern Lebanon. We've heard threats from militias in Lebanon, in Iraq, and Yemen that they will retaliate against U.S. targets if Israel mounts a land incursion or a full invasion of Gaza. That's something I'm watching very closely. There is a delicate and troubling web of alliances that connects a lot of these militant groups that call themselves resistance axis groups. So these are groups that are sort of share ties with Iran, opposition to the U.S., opposition to Israel. These groups have really deepened their operational ties a lot over the last 10 years, especially during the war in Syria. So there's a lot of risk that if and when Israel sends ground troops into Gaza, that we see retaliations around the region that could bring in non-state actors, but also potentially states and international powers like the United States. So that's something I'm concerned about and watching very closely and very anxiously.
Do you think American troops will be sent there?
I doubt we would see American troops being deployed to Israel's war with Hamas, but we have American troops in northeast Syria. We have American troops on the ground in Iraq. And then we have non-military U.S. presence around the region. Any and all of that is vulnerable to being targeted by these militant groups. And if that were to happen, I wouldn't expect America to send ground troops, but I would expect America to respond, whether that would be through airstrikes or through a real significant ramp up in the aid it's willing to give Israel as a partner force in that theater. In any version of this, it would be a deep U.S. implication in the conflict, even if it doesn't necessarily involve U.S. troops directly.
What would a peaceful end to this war look like? Is it even at all possible?
Whatever slim chance we had of an effective diplomatic resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is out the window for the near term. This phase of the conflict will come to an end at some point, probably in a matter of months and maybe thousands of dead. Maybe it'll be worse than that. At some point, whatever this phase is will come to a completion. And I fear that none of the underlying causes of this conflict will be resolved. The two-state solution, in my view, has been dead for a long time, but any kind of solution that would involve peaceful coexistence of Palestinians and Israelis under some framework of some legal framework with rights and citizenship for the different communities, I think that's going to be off the table for a very long time.
Any misconceptions that you want to clear up before we wrap up here today?
So I think it's really important that people who are concerned about Palestinian rights don't feel confused about condemning Hamas and understand that there's a way to support Palestinians without supporting extremists and people who commit atrocities and war crimes. I think it's really important to remember that Hamas doesn't represent Gazans and is not a democratically elected movement that is somehow a representative of these 2.25 million people who live under their boot. And I'd say it's really important for Israelis and supporters of this Israeli government to not fall into the misconception that the only way to find security for Israelis and for Jewish Israelis is to eradicate or dehumanize all Palestinians and maintain in perpetuity an occupation that has proven to be unsustainable. So I think that those key misconceptions are really getting in the way of people imagining an alternate future in which Israelis could be safe and Palestinians could have rights and people could live without fear of being murdered in their homes or at a music festival like so many hundreds of Israelis were on October 7th, or being bombed in their homes with their families as so many people in Gaza are in the aftermath.
What will life be like for the people in Israel in the near future?
Right now, for people who are in the combat zone, which includes all of Gaza and much of Israel, it's terrifying. It's terrifying, and it's something no one should wish on people they loathe or on their worst enemy. And I do think a thing that I would say is an opportunity to take from this horrible series of events is people who reacted with horror and solidarity to the hateful and horrible attacks on civilians in Israel on Saturday should keep that feeling close and try and extend it more widely. that circle of empathy that people extended to the victims of and the targets of the Hamas attacks should extend as much as possible that feeling of empathy and solidarity to all the civilians who are suffering in this war zone. The other thing I'd really like to see is people walking away from this kind of totalizing, dehumanizing language, right? I mean, I've heard terms thrown around this week, from officials talking about describing people in Gaza or Israel's enemies in Gaza as human animals, talking about eradication of groups and movements and people. And that is racialist hate speech. And it's the kind of thing that not only leads to war crimes and sometimes even to like genocidal activities, but it's the kind of language that precludes viewing the people on the other side of the conflict as human beings. It has been, unfortunately, a long-running part of this conflict. Until and unless it stops, we're never going to see any kind of effective move towards diplomacy and the political solutions that are going to be necessary to avoid a continuation of this endless cycle of tit-for-tat wars.
Well, thank you to our expert guest, Thanassis Cambanis. For more insights from him and his colleagues at Sentry International, check out the organization's website. We have a link in our show notes. And please be sure to share this episode if you found it helpful. All right, thank you again for joining us today. Of course, we will continue to bring you all of the major developments and ongoing developments in this conflict and all the other news of the day in our regular 10-minute news roundups Monday through Friday. So we'll be back on Monday.